Welcome to an ADD Woman podcast. On this episode, I'm so excited to talk to you about something that I feel very strongly about. How can I say this? Well, this episode is about a few things, but I think more than anything, it's about grit and whether or not you as an ADHD person have it. So you are starting to piece together that you might have ADHD. First and foremost, neurodivergence is a gift, not a curse. So if you've been thinking to yourself, I hate my brain, I get it. I had to go through a process of grieving the brain I wanted to have so I could accept the brain that I do have. And now that I have, I will tell you without a doubt, neurodivergence is a gift, not a curse. But how do you embrace that? Let's talk about the steps you can practice to help you start to flourish. Welcome to an ADD Woman podcast. I'm your host, Lacy Estelle, writer of all things about ADHD parenting and being an ADHD mother on Mothering the Storm with Lacy Estelle at lacyestelle.com. Here on an ADD Woman podcast, we're going to switch it up and talk about all things to do with ADHD as an adult woman and how we deal with it. Now you might be thinking, ADHD, women don't really have that. Actually, we do. We've all just been doing such a great job for years of masking it. So let's dive in. Let's talk about everything that our ADHD touches in our lives. And when I say everything, I mean everything. There is not one thing when you have ADHD that it doesn't affect. I'm so glad you're here. And if nothing else, I hope that you take away from this that you are not alone, you are not a failure, you are not lazy, and you are not stupid, and you are definitely not crazy. You just have ADHD, and you're just like me. So first and foremost, I want to talk about in this episode about something I've been told over so many times. If I talk to anybody about my story or I tell them where I came from or about my past, a lot of times they will say, wow, you're so resilient. And I think the first few times I heard it, I had to actually look it up because I just didn't really associate myself with any sort of positive affirmation of words. But resilience is just basically being able to roll with the punches. And that's putting it lightly, I would say. But it's a matter of, looking at your circumstances and saying, okay, this is what I have. This is the hand I've been dealt. What is my best option here? And I think success, first and foremost, is more about grit and resilience than it is about organization and time management. Now, I've met lots of successful people that are super well organized, manage their time great, and that's all fine and dandy, but that's not me. And that's not me because part of my brain doesn't function the same way theirs does. In that, it's ADHD. But, a little bit of it is also trauma. I had trauma as a child. And some of it is anxiety. And some of it is just silly little habits that I picked up on the way. But ultimately, you can get where you want to go if you just have perseverance and resilience and you're willing to adapt. Now, you can also get where you want to go probably a lot faster if you are organized and you manage your time really well. But for argument's sake, in this case, I'm not going to talk about that because we spend so much time as ADHD people comparing ourselves to other people. So screw that. I don't want to do that anymore, and I'm definitely not going to do that in this episode. First off, I want you to know one of the books that really, really changed my mindset when it came to realizing that I was capable of change, that even though I have an ADHD brain, I could still do things in my life that would impact my future. Even if my brain is operating at a deficit, it will still eventually gain momentum. And that is the book called Atomic Habits. It's by James Clear. If you haven't read it, it's excellent. You've probably heard of it, especially if you're anything like me and you're a self-starter and you want to look up business habits and business ideas and different things along those lines. It was a top recommended business book for me, but I found it was more of a life book. Now, I don't think James and I have the same background of beliefs. There is definitely some scientific stuff that he talks about that I'm not so sure my Christian faith would agree with. But on a deeper level, everything James tells you in that book is so good. And it is so well written and well thought out that after you read the book, you can't help but come away with a sense of, oh my gosh, I can do this. I can change. So let's go back a little ways and let's actually talk about how we decide, especially for me, okay, as a woman with ADHD, how did my brain decide what decisions I wanted to make and what decisions I don't want to make? And girls who possibly experience trauma in their childhood are going to be molded by such trauma. For example, if the father figure in your life leaves your family, or maybe your parents get divorced, your brain is going to recognize the pain of such a tragic event as trauma. Now, in trauma responses, your brain sort of shifts into survival mode. And when your brain actually experiences trauma, it takes the perceived or the real danger and gives you that fight or flight response. Now, when you have emotional trauma, the difference is there's no real reason for the fight or flight response. But what will happen if you have ADHD? Now, again, I say it on every episode at least once. I'm not a doctor. The things I talk about, some of these things, they sound great, but they are my theories based on the research that I've done, and I could be totally wrong. But understanding what I know about the ADHD brain, knowing that it is operating at a deficit and it is usually lacking dopamine, norepinephrine, sometimes serotonin, but a combination of those feel-good chemicals, right? When you have trauma and you're a child and you have either physical trauma or you have emotional trauma, and your brain goes into that fight or flight response, to deal with the trauma or the perceived dangerous thing that's happening to you, your brain is going to release a bunch of those chemicals. It's going to release a bunch of dopamine and norepinephrine. And it is the brain's natural way to release endorphins to help your brain cope with pain. But if you're not actually feeling physical pain, what you instead have now is what I think they call a trauma bond. You know, you have this perceived pain, but you're using that pain or that trauma experience that causes that pain. And so your body, in reaction to that pain, saying, okay, we feel this pain, but we don't want to feel it and we want to be able to deal with it, releases a whole bunch of extra dopamine. You're going to go through a time in your life where you're going to have a period of like this rush of that. And when you are a girl or a young girl or a woman who has ADHD and is already lacking in that area, it's going to totally shift your brain chemistry. And then what happens is you will shift from being, not necessarily saying that trauma causes ADHD. I don't necessarily think that, but I think it exacerbates it. So maybe you were on a path where even though you had ADHD and it was underlying and it was there, you were coping just fine. But your reserves are now gone and your brain is working inside panic mode because you've experienced a trauma. And it doesn't even have to be, I don't want anybody to listen or come away from this episode and think, oh, she's blaming the parents now. That's not it at all. I am a parent of an ADHD child. I've made several mistakes. I've forgiven myself for those mistakes and I try to do better, and that's all anybody can ever ask of anybody to do. What I am saying, though, is there sometimes are things in your childhood that you experience as trauma that aren't actually trauma, especially if you have ADHD. There can be, if you have ADHD and you have such a hard time emotionally with constructive feedback or criticism of any sort, your brain might recognize all of that as trauma. If your parents fight, even though every married couple fights in some way, now maybe they don't yell, but maybe your parents are yellers. Okay, your brain might still recognize those things as trauma, even though you're not in any real danger and it's just your environment. So that's what happens. And so what will happen to girls or women, and what I think definitely happened to me, is when that started to happen, when all of a sudden I was losing my regular dopamine and chemical suppliers, which would have been my humble, happy, cohesive home. And I'm not saying my parents' divorce is to blame for my ADHD. Mom, if you're listening to this, it's not your fault, and I love you. Anyways, so, if you experience something along those lines where you're getting a pretty good stream of dopamine, you're getting positive feedback, your parents are all there, everything is all together, it's all everything's good, right? You can come home, you know that life is good. And then trauma happens and trauma enters that ADHD brain, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. I need my stuff back. I need my stuff back. I need that nice, happy home back. I want to get back to that. When the trauma also happens, you have, this rush of dopamine, this rush of norepinephrine. You have all these chemicals just throwing at your brain to stop the pain. In doing so, when you have ADHD, you are going to avoid the emotional pain because that's what we do. We avoid it. So instead of going through it and processing it, now, you get a lot of parents who put their kids in therapy during traumatic events like this, and that's really, really good. But if you're not willing to go through the emotions, you stunt your growth. So what will end up happening is, your brain knows this sort of pain. It's intense and is as intense sometimes as physical pain. And because it kicks on your fight or flight response, but you can't physically do anything about it, sometimes this will come out in adolescents with more risk-taking behavior. They're acting out. They find themselves having a loss of respect for their family members. A lot of people will just categorize this sort of stuff as typical teenage drama. But when you have ADHD, a lot of times it's way more than that. Now, it might be expected. And I think what happens is parents, when they go through these things, that are out of their control. They get a divorce. They get in a bad relationship because they mistake somebody's character for being a good one. And then that person leaves, or that person hurts them in front of their children. They already are carrying so much self-blame. They can't sometimes, I feel like, bring themselves to not blame themselves for their child's poor behavior. And so sometimes what I see a lot of parents will do, and what I think my own mother might even admit to having done, is she was not only was she wrapped up in the pain she was feeling too, because we were experiencing trauma at the same time, but it was really hard for her to look outside of her own mistakes enough to recognize that some of the things that I was doing, even though they made sense with the timing of my traumas, they were also big, giant signs that I had ADHD too, and that I was dealing with that too. So trauma can tie the feeling of happiness to being broken and hearted, and then bam, you've got yourself set up for relationship pitfalls. So now as an adult, recognizing that your ADHD irregularities don't comprise who you actually are, but instead are just one component in the reasons behind your behavior, you can instead start to form habits out of self-awareness and move yourself in a direction towards better judgment. So I said that the first thing is definitely to recognize that finding success, whatever that looks like for you, okay, is more about grit and resilience when you're an ADHD person than it is about self-awareness and self-organization and time management. It's more about grit and resilience and perseverance, and sometimes even passion, which we are super good at, okay? We are super passionate people. You want to talk about hyperfixation? We are super passionate. So the next thing I think that it's important for you to do, besides just recognizing that, is you got to start asking yourself why you make the decisions you do. Now, I know anybody that's listening to me has been through cognitive behavioral therapy, which is general regular behavior therapy. You're saying, oh yeah, okay, yeah, I know, self-reflect. That's typical. But the truth of it is so important to get to the root of why you make the decisions you do. Or, okay, if you're like me and I spent majority of my 20s super indecisive, why am I so indecisive? What am I worried about? Who am I thinking about pleasing? Am I focusing on what is actually best for me or what will grow me? Or am I worried about saying this or saying yes to this or saying no to that because of somebody else's, or because of my perceived rejection from somebody else, which we talked about. I talked about that in a different episode about rejection being such a large component, especially for girls who have ADHD. We can handle being rejected. We just are going to cry about it and get really upset about it and dwell on it for way longer than we should. And it's going to affect our mood and everything else. But anyways, point being, If you can get to the bottom of why you're making the choices that you're making, why you're making the decisions the way that you're making them, why you are struggling to make the decisions the way you're making them, you can start to hinge on that true motivation behind all of your actions. It's hard. One of the best things that I think I did in my self-awareness journey was journaling. I would write down everything that was going on. When you decide to do something like journal, or a lot of times in our heads, especially when we have ADHD, things can get really black and white for us. And I know I'm going to talk about that here in just a second. But you don't have to write every tiny detail out. You don't have to write down every single thing you ate that day or the color of the sky. You can simply write. I used to have journal entries that was like, today is March 1st of 2012, and all I did today was wake up, eat breakfast, and took a nap and went back to bed. And it was fine. Lacy. What happens though is as I'm journaling, what I can then do is, okay, so say I did that, and a couple days later, all of a sudden I made this really bad judgment call on like my bank account. And I go back and I look over the last couple of days and I'm like, well, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I was kind of in a shell and not coming out. And maybe that's kind of a sign that I'm going to do something impulsive in an effort to just get that chemical balance going. When you start to do these things and you start doing things like journaling and you start to figure out why you're making the decisions that you're making, you can self-reflect and you can change direction. And that brings me to suggestion number 3. Ask yourself what the type of person you want to be, what do they do? And I'm not saying what do they do for a job or a career or whatever. I'm saying what do they do? How do they make decisions? What kind of decisions do they make? How do they decide on certain behavior? And what would it take for you to become that person? Now, I'm going to pause here for a second because I'm about to tell you something and you're going to be like, but no, I'm not. And I'm just going to tell you right now, you are. There's a spoiler alert here. You are already that person. You don't need to actually go become that person. That person and you are one and the same. You are totally capable of being all the things that you want to become. You are. You're in there. You know it. I know it. Deep down inside, you know it. Your mom probably knows it. I'm saying that because once you recognize that you can be that person, and I know it sounds so cliche, you can be whatever you want, but it's true. You have ADHD. You have a different kind of brain. Yeah, but that doesn't mean jack. It doesn't. You can still find success. Maybe it's going to take you a couple more tries. Maybe it's going to be harder for you in some ways and easier for you in other ways. So what? You are already that person. All you have to do to move in that direction is start taking small steps. And when I talked about it in the beginning of this podcast, and I said to go read the book by James Clear, what he talks about is the idea of 1% improvement each year on your habits. So many people will be like, oh, this is the year I'm going to eat better and work out every day. And they kind of set themselves up for failure. And one thing that was taught to me when I started becoming a content creator and I started my blog was that when you reach goals, they can be on a spectrum. And I know I've talked about spectrums when it comes to mental illness. Why can't we put goals on that? Yes, I smash my goal if I get this many podcast downloads. Okay. But I'm still going to be really happy if I get this many. And that's my swing. That's point A or point B. And anywhere I land in between is pretty good. If you are at least taking steps in the direction that you want to go, you are already on your way. And I know I'm probably saying like every cliche thing in the book, but as an ADHD person, it's really important that you recognize that, because you can get stuck. You will make yourself stuck if you cannot realize or find a way to accept your weaknesses, embrace your strengths, and just keep going. So, because I know that you already are this person, I'm going to tell you the most important thing you need to do is you have to learn to accept your faults. Not only do you have to accept your faults, but you have to forgive yourself for all the mistakes you've made so far. That one's always hard for me. I have to forgive myself a lot. And I have to humble myself before my God, because I'm Christian. And I spent years doing things that God would not have wanted me to do, because I didn't trust him. I didn't trust him with how he made me. I didn't trust him with what I understood about him. But I will tell you, once I really got to know him, there is no one I trust more. So you have to accept your faults. And you have to accept that you're not going to get it all right. Even if you have ADHD, it's okay. Nobody, neurotypicals, are not perfect. They have weaknesses too. They do. So what? They don't have ADHD and they're on time all the time. Who cares? They're not perfect. They have things that they struggle in. And so if you can recognize that everybody, not just you, everybody is working towards betterment. They're either working towards betterment or they are stunting their own growth. Period. There's no in between. You're either stuck where you are, or you're going to look at the stuff you have and you're going to go, okay, I'm going to keep going. One foot in front of the other. Baby steps. If I have to crawl, I will keep going. Realizing that our circumstances only win the day over us if they allow us to stay defeated. And as long as you continue to persevere, you will find success in whatever form that looks like. Now, for me, these days, it looks like a comfy couch, a fairly clean, picked up home, a husband who knows I love him and loves me well, church on Sundays, and my kids have brushed their teeth and don't stink. And they're kind of nice. And that's setting the bar probably pretty low. But to me, that's all I need. Deep down, even if you're the person out there listening to me, and while you're also listening to like 4 other podcasts all about business, and you know in your gut and you're telling yourself, I'm going to be a millionaire one day. That's great. But I want to go back to number 2, where I said you need to start asking yourself why you make those decisions. I'm so glad you're here and you're listening to this. Why is it that you want to be a millionaire? What is it that makes you think that having wild success with money, what is it that money will bring you? Is it peace? Is it security? Is it joy? If you answered yes to any of those things, then you need to go back and you need to write down the thing you're actually chasing. Not the money, but maybe it's joy, or maybe it's security, or maybe it's love. And if it's any of those things, you need to actually chase those directly, not the thing you think will bring you that. And the reason I say that is if you have ADHD and you're like me, you will chase entrepreneurship, you will chase success, you will chase relationships, you will change jobs, you will chase having a house. You will chase your way to finding fulfillment only to get there and realize that none of those things will actually bring you true fulfillment. None of them, regardless of your ADHD. The only thing that brings those things is the truth. And if you're Christian and you're listening to my podcast, you know who I'm talking about. You will have to forgive yourself repeatedly, because you'll take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and 2 steps forward and 4 steps back. And that's okay. We're not working towards world peace. I mean, yes, obviously we want that. But the things that we're changing in ourselves, they're not going to be an overnight thing. If anybody listening to this podcast is an avid workout person, you work out all the time, you build strength, you build muscle, you know better than probably anybody else that you didn't get the biceps you have by going to the gym one time. And We know that. As an ADHD person, we know that. We can see it. I can see that that person deciding to change took a really long time. We will set ourselves up for failure by thinking in our minds that it's either this or it's that it's black or it's white. And let me just tell you, it's not black and white. It's not. Especially when you have ADHD. You might decide, I'm going to go to the gym. I want to do better this year. I want to work out. And you're going to go and you're like, you got that startup dopamine of starting a new project and starting a new habit. And you're all excited and you're going and you're going to go. And you go for like 15 days straight. And then what happens? You're like, oh, I don't want to get up today. I'll go tomorrow. I don't want to really get up tomorrow. So I'll go another day. And next thing you know, it's been like 4 weeks. And then what do? You tell yourself, it's been 4 weeks. I can't go. I quit. Clearly, I must have quit. You didn't freaking quit. You just haven't gone for 4 weeks. And that's that. Go. Get up and go. I don't care if you went for 10 days and then stopped going for 6 months. As long as you go back, you're going to continue to go. Right? That was the shift for me. Realizing that just because I stopped doing something or just because I didn't hit my mark and check every single box, okay, didn't mean that I didn't make progress. I still made progress. You can still make progress. Things are not black and white. When you have ADHD, there's this whole giant gray area. And sometimes that gray area means that we sit in our bed under our covers for hours, days, and we do nothing and we're not going to do the dishes. But guess what? When we get out of bed finally and we're like, okay, we got to deal with our crap, we're going to do the dishes. Just because you didn't do them 3 days ago doesn't mean that you can't do them today. Just because you went to the gym a month ago doesn't mean you can't go today. Just because you wanted to finish that book and you only read 16 pages doesn't mean you can't pick it up today, even though it's been sitting there collecting dust for 6 months. Pick it up today, read another page. If you can embrace that and you can forgive yourself for not getting it right all the time, because nobody does. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to fail. You're going to have setbacks. You're going to have times where you are going to do something and you're going to go, there's a terrible mistake. And now I have to deal with the consequences of it. Okay, keep going. Here's the truth. The world likes to tell us that we can't change. I know you've heard this before. People don't change. People don't change. If you go talk to any 70-year-old and ask them if they are exactly the same as they were in their 30s, they might say that some of the things about them have stayed the same, but they're going to tell you they've changed drastically and dramatically because life demands growth from us. It demands it. If you're not willing to grow, then the only thing you're doing is stunting yourself and stunting your own success. But growth doesn't always look the way that we who have ADHD perceive it to look. A lot of us think that it's either you're going to be successful or you're not. Or you're going to be married and have 2.5 kids by 25 or you're not. Or you're going to have bought your first house by the time you're 30 or you're not. And it just doesn't work that way. It doesn't. You have to learn to love where you are, and you have to learn to love the process of getting to where you want to be. And like I said, life demands growth from us. And if you are busy sabotaging your own life, it's because you don't want to grow. You don't want to do the hard things. You don't want to keep going forward and go, oh, man, this sucks. Okay, let's go avoid it. I'm going to go drink, or I'm going to go blow all my rent money. You're better than that. I don't mean that to sound like your parent that hounds you all the time. I mean that as in, when you look at the person that you really want to be, that person feels secure enough in themselves and trusts themselves enough to make good decisions about their money, to make good decisions about their behavior, to make good decisions. But they didn't get that way because they just snapped their fingers or they were born with perfect brains. They got that way from practice. Now, if you have ADHD, you're like, but I try and I fail. Try and fail again. Keep going. Try and fail. Try again and fail. Try again and get closer. Fail still, but get closer. It's progress. There's something that I've been telling my 12-year-old because he struggles so much with getting his homework done. He doesn't want to do his assignments. I get it. I had ADHD too. I didn't want to either. I started telling him, I said, stop looking at them as being so overwhelming and just do them. I don't even care if you get them all right. I don't even care if what you jot down on the paper is just something so you can turn it in. Done is better than perfect. And here's what I have found is that if you just do the practice of doing the motion, of trying to do the thing, okay, of trying to do the homework, of trying to finish the project, of reading one page, it does. James Clear is right. And I know he cites his information from somebody else who talks about habits, but there is compound interest in human change when you are trying to when you focus on just moving the needle by 1%. Even with us who have ADHD, we can change. We can grow. I remember being 21 and thinking to myself, by the time my oldest is in kindergarten, I'm going to have it figured out. And by the time, my youngest is in preschool, I'm going to have it figured out. By the time I'm 25, I'm going to have it all figured out. By the time I'm 30, I'm going to have it way figured out. And it doesn't work that way. I'm going to turn 32 this year. I get a lot of listeners that I know that are, in their 40s and 50s, and you're probably hearing my age and going, oh man, I wish I knew the things that you know when you're 32. But there's a lot I don't know. There is a lot that I don't know. And I will have never arrived. Ever. And because of that, I think that mindset is the only proponent I truly have towards success. Because if I recognize that I'm not perfect and nobody else is either, I can then instead choose who I want to listen to. And I can choose how I want to form my decisions. And I can look at my behavior and I can say, okay, I did this and it seemed like it stemmed from this. So what if I changed just that one tiny thing? Does that make a difference? You don't even have to do it consciously, because I can tell you, I've been practicing doing all these things for years, and I still have days that I don't even really recognize that I'm doing them. But I'm doing them because I'm here talking to you on a podcast. And when I started my blog 5 years ago, I can tell you hands down, I have had several reasons to quit. Several reasons. And I just told myself, keep going, keep trying, keep turning the wheel, keep turning the wheel, keep turning the wheel. If God doesn't will it, he'll stand in my way. But from what I've found, I continue to experience growth, not only in financial circumstances, but in networking circumstances, in friendships and relationships and people I meet. And that's so important. So trying is really all we have. A lot of people say, oh, there's do or not do. That's crap. Do or not do. There is no try. I get it. I'm a Star Wars fan. But when you have ADHD, that mindset can keep us stuck. I don't want you to be stuck anymore. I was stuck. You're not stuck. Nobody has it all together. Nobody. And someone else's weaknesses are our strengths. I want you to keep in mind that perception when you have ADHD is so much. Just today, me and my son, my 12-year-old, we were over in our old neighborhood. It's not in the greatest part of town. And I asked him, we were leaving his basketball game, and he's 12 now. And I asked him, I said, hey, you want to drive by the old apartment? He said, yeah. And I said, okay. And now you just go about 5 or 6 years back for me, driving past that old apartment probably would have been pretty triggering. I don't even know if I would have been able to do it because I experienced my young 20s there, experienced my first real issue with postpartum. I had my second son there, and I made so many mistakes in that apartment. But he wanted to drive by it, so we did. He told me all sorts of silly, funny stories, silly, funny memories that he has of it, silly, funny things that he did. Evidently, he named our tiles in our bathroom in that apartment, and I think that's just hilarious. And we laughed, and I drove away, and he asked me if we could also go around the corner to my mother's house, my mother's old house, because that was one of the big perks of that apartment that I had. It was very close to my parents at the time. And we drove over there, and he told me other funny stories he had from when he was really little in that house, and we laughed, and I told him I was so happy that his memories of that place were happy ones. And he said, yeah, I really loved living there. It was home. Now that's relating it to my parenthood, but even if you take every mistake you've ever made, I don't even care if you made some capital punishment mistake and you went to prison, you are allowed to change. Your ADHD does not define you. Now, it is how your brain is hardwired, and you have to learn to work with it. But it is not who you are. Instead of being stuck and feeling like you just can't, or you would never do that, you have to start telling yourself that your ADHD does not define you, and it does not get to decide what you are good at or not good at. Only you and God get to decide that. And 2, it's okay to fail. It's okay to screw it up. It's okay to not do it right the first time, 5th time, or even the 10th time, as long as you keep going. That's all. That's all you need. Perseverance, grit, and resilience. So that's where I leave you. That's going to wrap up this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it's a little bit of tough love, but please know, coming through this microphone, when I talk to whoever's listening out there, in my mind, I'm talking to 21-year-old me who believed a lot of lies about who I was and who I was going to be based on a lot of other people's perception of who I was. And at the end of the day, when I really realized who I was, I saw so many of people's misperceptions because I just had ADHD and they didn't notice. And instead, what I found was underneath all my ADHD, I'm smart and I'm caring and I'm kind and I love people. I don't always tolerate them very well because I have sensory issues and I have anxiety, but I do really love them. I love them. Every person has an experience worth learning from, including you. You just have to learn to take from your own experience. And then, if you're really good, you learn to take from other people's experiences too and say, oh, I don't want to ever do that, so I'm going to make sure I don't do that. And that's it. Now, you're like, but what about medication? What about therapy? Keep going. Get those things or don't get those things. But keep going. Pick a direction and go. And as long as you don't stop, no matter how many times you fall, you're going to get there. I have faith in you. Not to mention, I know God's with you. And I know that 21-year-old me, she'd really need to hear that right about now. I hope that this episode fills you with the love that I'm trying to convey in it. I'll talk to you soon. That is going to wrap up this episode of an ADD Woman podcast. What did you think? How do you feel? I would love to hear from you. And if any of the things I just said are of interest to you, I'd strongly recommend that you check out the blog, which is hosted at lacyestelle.com. On there, I talk about all things ADHD parenting when you're an adult with ADHD as well, and how to deal with it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Love to hear what you think, and I'll be talking to you guys soon.